My brother violently ripped my custom wig right off my head at my wedding while I was fighting a brutal battle with cancer. My own mother sat in the front row and laughed, telling the groom he deserved a real woman, not a bald ghost. She screamed for me to take it off and let him see what I really was. They thought they were completely ruining my big day, but they never saw what was coming next. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. I am Zuri, 32 years old, and until that precise moment at the altar, I truly thought I had already survived the hardest fight of my life. For 6 grueling months, I had battled an aggressive form of breast cancer. I endured the relentless nausea, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the agonizing loss of my thick hair. But standing there under a breathtaking floral arch, holding hands with my fiancé Julian, I felt nothing but radiant happiness. Julian is a high-powered corporate attorney, a man who held my hand through every single chemotherapy session and who carefully shaved my head himself when the strands started falling out in clumps on my pillow. We were surrounded by 300 guests at one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in Atlanta. I wore an intricate custom lace front wig that cost me thousands of dollars. It was expertly styled and designed to make me feel beautiful and normal on the most important day of my life. I just wanted to feel like myself again before the sickness took over completely. The sanctuary was beautifully decorated with white roses and cascading orchids. The string quartet had just finished playing a beautiful melody, and the pastor smiled warmly at us. He spoke about love and endurance through sickness and health, and then he asked the traditional question of whether anyone had a reason why we should not be wed. It was supposed to be a rhetorical pause, a brief moment of silence before we exchanged our rings and promised our lives to one another. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary slammed open with a loud bang that made everyone in the room jump. My older brother Jamal stumbled down the aisle. He reeked of cheap whiskey and bitter resentment, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his tie hanging loose around his neck. He pushed past the horrified ushers who tried to intercept him, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the polished white marble floor. Jamal was the golden child. He was the son my mother Brenda practically worshipped while viewing my darker skin and natural drive as some sort of threat to her own insecurities. But as he stomped toward the altar, his golden boy facade was completely shattered by his own toxic entitlement. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me, his voice slurring, but loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceilings. "You think you are so much better than me?" he shouted, spit flying from his lips. "You think just because you run some fancy business downtown, you can throw this massive party while my logistics company is drowning?" My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I squeezed Julian's hands tighter, trying to stay grounded and keep the tears of humiliation from falling. But Jamal did not stop his tirade. He climbed the 3 steps to the altar, staggering slightly as he breached our sacred space. The pastor stepped back in shock, holding his Bible to his chest. "It is pathetic," Jamal sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "A sick woman playing dress-up. You are practically on your deathbed, Zuri. You do not even deserve this lavish wedding while your own flesh and blood goes bankrupt trying to survive. You are just a walking charity case begging for attention." He was projecting his own miserable failures onto me, unable to handle the hard fact that my crisis management firm was thriving while his poorly managed logistics business was bleeding money every single day. He needed someone to blame for his own incompetence, and as the designated family scapegoat, I was his easiest target. Before Julian or the groomsmen could fully process his venomous words and react, Jamal lunged forward. His large hand grabbed a tight fistful of my expensive custom wig. With a violent, vicious jerk, he ripped it clean off my head. The tearing sound of the lace ripping away from the adhesive on my skin seemed magnified in the sudden dead silence of the sanctuary. The cold air of the air-conditioned room hit my completely bare, scarred scalp. 300 guests gasped in unison. It was a collective sound of pure shock and horror that vibrated through the wooden pews and the floorboards beneath my feet. The beautiful hair I had spent hours having styled now hung limply from Jamal's fist, like some twisted hunting trophy. I stood there, exposed and vulnerable, stripped of the armor I had purchased to feel like a radiant bride. Julian saw red. My normally composed, brilliant fiancé dropped my hands and stepped forward. His jaw clenched so tight, a muscle ticked in his cheek. His fists balled tight at his sides, ready to strike. He was fully prepared to lay my brother out right there on the altar steps, regardless of the audience or the religious setting. He lunged toward Jamal to end the disrespect permanently and protect me from any further harm. But before Julian could even raise his arm to throw a punch, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. A sharp, echoing laugh sliced through the horrified silence of the room. It was not a nervous chuckle or a gasp of disbelief from a guest. It was a deep belly laugh, full of mockery and cruel satisfaction. I looked down past the shocked faces of my bridesmaids and the gaping mouths of Julian's family. There, in the very front row, my own mother Brenda was rising from her pew. She was pointing straight at my bare head, her face twisted in a gleeful sneer, completely delighted by my ultimate public humiliation. The sound hit me harder than Jamal's physical assault. It was a sharp, echoing cackle that bounced off the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows of the sanctuary. It was not a nervous chuckle or a gasp of disbelief. It was a deep belly laugh, full of mockery and cruel satisfaction. Julian froze mid-lunge, his fists still balled at his sides as he snapped his head toward the front row. I followed his gaze, my bare scalp tingling in the cold air. My mother Brenda was standing up from her designated pew. She wore a silver silk gown that I had paid for a dress she had demanded to ensure she looked like the wealthy matriarch she desperately pretended to be. But there was nothing maternal about the way she was looking at me right now. She lifted a manicured finger and pointed straight at my scarred, hairless head. "Look at her, Julian!" my mother shouted, her voice carrying easily across the silent, horrified crowd of 300 guests. "My son just did you the biggest favor of your life. You are a successful attorney. You deserve a real woman, not some bald ghost playing dress-up." A collective murmur of absolute shock rippled through Julian's family on the groom's side of the aisle. My bridesmaids behind me gasped, some covering their mouths in horror. But my mother did not care about the optics. She was entirely in her element, thriving on the chaos she and her golden boy had just created. She stepped out of the pew and moved toward the center aisle, standing right behind Jamal, who was still clutching my custom wig like a hunting trophy. "Do not look so angry, Julian," she continued, stepping closer to the altar with her chin held high. "You should be thanking Jamal. He is showing you the truth. Zuri has always been like this, always manipulating people to get what she wants. She is using this sickness to trap you into marrying her because she knows she could never keep a man like you otherwise." The venom in her words was not new to me. It was the same toxic script I had been forced to memorize since childhood. Standing there exposed, I felt the familiar weight of my mother's deep-seated colorism and relentless favoritism washing over me. Brenda had always viewed my darker skin and natural, relentless drive as a personal threat. Growing up in a household that worshipped proximity to whiteness, Jamal had been her prize. He was born with a lighter complexion, hazel eyes, and an easy, superficial charm that my mother equated with inherent superiority. She poured every ounce of her affection, every word of praise, and every single dollar she could scrape together into Jamal's future. When I brought home straight A report cards, she ignored them. When I started my first business out of my college dorm room, she called it a cute little hobby. But when Jamal decided he wanted to start a logistics company, she mortgaged her own future to fund it. She made it very clear, my mother yelled, pointing at me again. "She is too dark, too hard, and too stubborn to ever know her place. Jamal is a businessman. He has the look and the legacy of this family. I gave him everything because he actually has a future. Zuri just wants everyone to feel sorry for her because she lost her hair and got a little sick." A little sick. I had spent 6 months vomiting until I coughed up blood. I had endured surgeries and radiation burns that left my skin raw and blistered. I had fought tooth and nail just to survive long enough to walk down this aisle. And my mother reduced my battle with cancer to a manipulative pity tactic. Julian stepped directly in front of me, shielding my body with his own. His voice was dangerously low, shaking with a quiet rage I had never heard from him before. "Get out," he ordered my mother and brother. "Both of you, turn around and walk out of this church before I have you physically thrown into the street." Brenda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively at my furious fiancé. "You are making a mistake, Julian. You are tying yourself to damaged goods." That was when the voice chimed in from the third row. It was high-pitched, whiny, and dripping with unearned entitlement. Jamal's white wife, Chloe, leaned out into the aisle. She was wearing a dress that looked more suited for a nightclub than a sanctuary, and she had an arrogant smirk plastered across her face. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down with blatant disgust. "Honestly, Zuri, you should be grateful we even showed up to this pity party," Chloe announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the back pews. "You have been milking this cancer thing for months just to get out of helping Jamal with his business. We only came today because you promised an open bar at the reception." The absolute audacity of her statement hung in the air. This woman who had contributed nothing to our family, who lived entirely off the funds Jamal embezzled from my mother, and secretly from me, was standing in my wedding venue insulting my character. She thought she was untouchable because she had married the golden child. She thought her proximity to Jamal gave her a free pass to disrespect me in public. Julian moved to signal the security team stationed at the back of the church, but I reached out and wrapped my fingers gently around his wrist. The warmth of his skin grounded me. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air wash over my bare head. I stepped out from behind Julian's protective stance and walked slowly down the 3 marble steps toward Jamal. My brother gripped the wig tightly, anticipating a physical fight. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to have a complete hysterical breakdown so he could prove to everyone that I was the unstable, damaged woman he and my mother claimed I was. I did not give him the satisfaction. I stopped 2 feet in front of him. I reached out and calmly, firmly grabbed the lace edge of the wig hanging from his fist. I pulled it straight out of his hand with a sharp tug. Jamal blinked in surprise, stumbling back a half step. I looked down at the beautiful, expensive hair in my hands. I ran my thumb over the delicate lace, feeling the adhesive that had been torn from my skin. Then I looked up at my mother, my brother, and my smirking sister-in-law. I did not put the wig back on. Julian's muscles are tight like coiled steel. I reach out and press my palm flat against his chest, right over his racing heart, applying firm, steady pressure. He looks down at me, his eyes blazing with a protective fury that takes my breath away. He is a high-powered corporate attorney who spends his days ruthlessly dismantling hostile takeovers and crushing arrogant executives in the boardroom. He knows exactly how toxic my bloodline is because he has spent the last 3 years watching them try to drain me dry. He is entirely ready to unleash that same ruthless energy on my brother right here in the sanctuary. He wants to end the disrespect permanently and protect me from any further harm. But I shake my head slowly. I will not let Jamal turn my wedding day into a crime scene, and I will not let my mother turn my survival into a circus. I refuse to cry. I refuse to run away. I stand up straighter, letting the cool air wash over my completely bald head. Every single scar and every uneven patch of skin from my aggressive treatments is fully exposed to the harsh sanctuary lighting. My mother expects me to crumble to the floor and sob. She expects me to hide my face in shame so she can finally prove to Julian that I am broken goods. I deny her that satisfaction. I lock eyes with Brenda, holding her cruel, mocking gaze until her laughter slowly dies in her throat. The silence in the room becomes heavy, suffocating, and entirely focused on my quiet defiance. Jamal stands on the altar steps, breathing heavily, clutching my ruined wig in his fist like a trophy. I look right through him as if he does not even exist. I turn my back to my toxic family and face the pastor. The poor man is trembling, his hands gripping his leather-bound Bible so tightly his knuckles have turned stark white. Finish the ceremony, I demand, my voice ringing out clear and steady across the massive room. Do it right now. The pastor swallows hard and nods hastily. He finds his place on the page and begins speaking again, his voice shaking slightly at first before gaining strength. Julian takes both of my hands in his. He does not look at my mother. He does not look at Jamal. He looks only at me. His gaze traces the smooth bare curve of my scalp and then meets my eyes with an overwhelming fierce rush of love. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, he says, his voice carrying effortlessly over the quiet crowd. He does not pity me. He respects the hell out of me. We exchange our vows with unbroken eye contact. Every word we speak is a deliberate strike against the toxicity trying to suffocate us. When Julian promises to love me in sickness and in health, the words carry the heavy weight of the hospital waiting rooms, the midnight panics, and the endless chemotherapy sessions we have already survived together. He is my absolute anchor. I speak my vows back to him loudly and clearly, making sure every single person in the room hears my unwavering certainty. I am stripping my family of the one thing they wanted most, which was the power to ruin my day. They wanted a tragedy, and I am giving them a triumph. The pastor pronounces us husband and wife. Julian pulls me close and kisses me deeply, completely, ignoring the gasps and angry murmurs from my side of the aisle. When we break apart, the sanctuary erupts. It is not the sound of mockery, it is the sound of 300 guests rising to their feet in a massive standing ovation. Julian's family is weeping with pride. My true friends are cheering loudly. The overwhelming wave of love and admiration drowns out my mother's bitter presence entirely. Julian wraps our hands together and we turn to make our walk of defiance down the center aisle. I keep my chin high, my bare head held with the grace of a queen wearing a crown. I feel the warmth of our guests leaning in to whisper words of encouragement as we pass. But as we reach the third row, the supportive atmosphere fractures for a brief second. Jamal's wife, Chloe, leans out into the aisle, effectively blocking our path for a fraction of a moment. Her face is a mask of petty vindictiveness. She leans close to my ear, her cheap perfume masking the scent of the white roses decorating the pews. Enjoy the fake sympathy while it lasts, Zuri. She whispers, her voice dripping with venom. You are going to need it. But remember, you are paying for our VIP reception table anyway, so we will be sure to drink all your top-shelf champagne at your little pity party. She smirks, stepping back into her pew, thinking she has delivered the ultimate parting shot. She thinks she has secured a luxurious night out on my dime to celebrate my public humiliation. I do not flinch. I do not break my stride. I look at her smug face, and I simply smile. It is a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that makes her smirk falter instantly. Julian and I continue walking, pushing through the heavy oak doors and stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight. I let the warmth hit my face and smile even wider. Chloe is entirely convinced she is about to max out my platinum card at the luxury reception venue. She has absolutely no idea that the credit card she thinks she is using was permanently canceled by me, exactly 20 minutes before the ceremony even began. The doors of the St. Regis ballroom swung open to reveal a reception space that was nothing short of spectacular. I had spent months planning every single detail, from the towering centerpieces of white orchids to the custom monogrammed dance floor. It was meant to be a celebration of life and love after 6 months of sheer medical hell. Julian wrapped his arms securely around my waist as we walked in, taking a moment to just breathe. But that peace was shattered before we even made it to our sweetheart table. Jamal and Chloe marched into the venue, acting as though they were walking the red carpet at a movie premiere. They completely ignored the seating chart displayed at the entrance and headed straight for the elevated VIP lounge. That specific area, with its white leather couches and premium view of the stage, had been strictly reserved for Julian's elderly grandparents and the dedicated oncology nurses who had saved my life. Chloe did not care. She literally brushed past Julian's grandmother, nearly knocking the poor woman off balance, to claim the best seat in the center of the lounge. Jamal plopped down next to her, spreading his arms wide and snapping his fingers at a passing server. He demanded 3 bottles of their most expensive vintage champagne immediately. I stood near the edge of the dance floor watching this absurd spectacle unfold. Chloe was already waving over a group of their loud, obnoxious friends who had no business being at my wedding in the first place. She accepted a freshly poured glass of champagne and began holding court, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen. Her voice pierced right through the soft jazz music playing in the background. She tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder and took a sip of the $500 champagne. "We just decided to go all out for this little event," she boasted to her friends, gesturing vaguely around the opulent ballroom. "You know how it is with family money. Jamal works so incredibly hard running his empire as CEO, so we wanted to throw a decent party. Honestly, Zuri should be thanking us on her knees. With all her expensive medical treatments, she is just lucky we have the resources to bail her out and give her a nice day." Her absolute delusion was sickening, but not surprising. Chloe was the ultimate parasite feeding off Jamal's completely fabricated image of wealth. She loved playing the role of the rich, supportive sister-in-law while wearing knockoff designer dresses and relying on funds my brother embezzled. They were both living in a fantasy world, convinced that because I was sick, I was somehow too weak to notice their relentless theft. My mother Brenda strutted over to join them in the VIP section, taking a seat next to Jamal and glaring at me with a look of pure triumph. She raised her glass in my direction, a silent, mocking toast. They were drinking top-shelf liquor, taking over my reception and acting like they were the gracious hosts of my pity party. Julian stepped closer to me, his entire body rigid with anger. He asked me if I wanted him to signal the security team to drag them out by their collars. I placed my hand gently on his chest and smiled up at him. I told him to be patient and just watch the kitchen doors because the real entertainment was about to begin. I had planned this reception with military precision, and that included anticipating my family's boundless greed. Across the massive ballroom, the venue manager emerged from the double doors of the catering kitchen. He was a strict, highly professional man, dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo. He walked with a determined, brisk pace, completely bypassing my table and heading directly toward the VIP section, where my family was currently demanding another round of drinks. In his right hand, he carried a small, polished silver tray. Chloe spotted him approaching, and her eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. She nudged Jamal sharply in the ribs and loudly announced to her friends that the manager must be bringing out the exclusive reserve caviar she had demanded earlier. She sat up straighter, adjusting her dress and wearing a sickeningly sweet smile of extreme entitlement. Brenda looked on with deep pride, watching her golden child receive the royal treatment she believed he deserved. The manager stopped right in front of their table. He did not bow or offer a polite customer service smile. His face was stone cold. He leaned forward and placed the polished silver tray directly on the glass table in front of Jamal. There was no caviar. There was no complimentary champagne. Resting right in the center of that shiny silver tray was a brightly printed notification from the venue accounting department. It was a formal, loudly stamped alert for a declined credit card transaction totaling exactly $45,000 for the catering and premium bar tab. From my seat at the sweetheart table, I watched the arrogant smirk completely slide off Chloe's face. The heavy silver tray had hit the glass table with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the ballroom. Jamal snatched the slip of paper from the manager, his eyes scanning the numbers before his jaw dropped in absolute shock. Brenda, who was sitting right next to them sipping her expensive champagne, leaned over to look at the paper. I watched her expression shift from entitled smugness to sheer panic. She looked up and her eyes darted frantically across the room until they locked onto mine. She did not look sorry. She looked furious. She shoved her chair back with such force it scraped loudly against the floorboards. Her silver silk gown swished violently around her ankles as she stomped across the custom monogram dance floor, making a direct line for where Julian and I were sitting. She was keeping a tight plastic smile on her face for the sake of the other guests, but her eyes were completely cold and full of rage. She was not coming over to apologize for Jamal ripping my wig off. She was coming to manage the optics and demand I fix her problem. Brenda reached our table and leaned heavily over the floral arrangement, blocking the view of the event photographer. She spoke through clenched teeth, her voice a harsh, aggressive whisper. She told me to stop playing games and fix the credit card immediately. She said Jamal had important investors in that VIP section who were getting thirsty, and that my little stunt was embarrassing the family. Julian placed his hands on the edge of the table, ready to stand up and physically remove her, but I slid my hand over his and squeezed his fingers. I took a very slow, calm sip of my ice water. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and told her the card on file was not broken. I told her the card was simply empty. Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were a stubborn child throwing a tantrum. She told me to stop acting like a victim and give the manager my corporate black card. She said she knew I had plenty of money hidden away in my crisis management business accounts. I leaned forward, mirroring her aggressive posture. I asked her exactly which money she thought I was using to fund this wedding. I asked if she meant the money from my business or the money from the joint family emergency account. The plastic smile permanently froze on Brenda's face. The color drained from her cheeks for a fraction of a second before her natural defensive anger kicked right back in. She glanced nervously at Julian, who was watching her with absolute disgust. I refused to let her look away from me. I reminded her of the exact date 4 months ago. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed in the intensive care unit. My body was burning from the aggressive chemotherapy chemicals pumping through my veins. I was unconscious, hooked up to heart monitors and fighting every single second just to stay alive. And while I was fighting for my life, she and Jamal were sitting comfortably in a bank manager's office. Through clenched teeth, I laid out the exact transaction history for her to hear. I told her I knew they had drained $80,000 from the joint emergency account. That was money I had diligently deposited month after month for 5 years to ensure our family would always have a safety net in case of a medical crisis or disaster. I asked her how Chloe was enjoying the brand new luxury SUV they bought with my chemotherapy money. I asked her how Jamal's failing logistics company was doing after they pumped $40,000 of my savings into its negative balance just to make his payroll and keep up his fake image of being a successful chief executive officer. I expected her to show at least a single ounce of remorse. I expected her to look down in shame. But Brenda did not flinch. Her jaw set hard, and she leaned even closer to my face. She whispered that Jamal was the man of the house, and he needed that money to secure his legacy. She actually had the nerve to look at me and say that I was in a hospital bed with one foot in the grave and did not need the cash anyway. She told me family money was for the living and for building a future, and Jamal's business was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. She had fully expected me to quietly pass away from the cancer, leaving them my entire estate to fund their ridiculous delusions of grandeur. She assumed I was paying for this entire reception using that exact same joint account. She was completely unaware that I had severed all my ties to it the very moment I discovered their theft 3 days ago. She thought the card I placed on file for their VIP section was drawing from the well she and Jamal had already run dry. She called me selfish for tracking the money while I was sick. She said a good, loyal daughter would have offered those funds willingly to save her older brother from public bankruptcy. Julian finally spoke up, his voice dangerously soft and precise. He told Brenda she was guilty of wire fraud and grand larceny. He promised her that by Monday morning he would personally ensure she was speaking to federal investigators about the stolen funds. But Brenda completely ignored him. She only cared about the people watching her right now. She only cared about Chloe throwing a tantrum in the VIP lounge and the venue manager standing by their table holding a declined bill for $45,000 that they could not pay. Brenda slammed her hand flat onto our sweetheart table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes. She gave me an ultimatum right there in front of the entire ballroom. She demanded that I reach into my bag, pull out my personal corporate card, and hand it to the manager immediately to cover their tab. If I refused, she promised to make a scene that would make the sanctuary incident look like a warm-up. She threatened to march back to the VIP section, gather Jamal, Chloe, and every single extended family member on our side of the guest list, and walk right out the front doors. She said she would leave my wedding completely empty and ruin my reception, ensuring everyone in Atlanta knew I was a bitter, vindictive sister who drove her own family away on her wedding day. My mother stood there, panting slightly from her own aggressive tirade, expecting me to beg her to stay. She expected me to burst into tears and plead with her not to ruin my special day. She honestly believed that the threat of losing my extended family would break me into a million compliant pieces. I looked at her twisted, angry face and felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of relief. "Leave then," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "Please, Brenda, gather up every single person who shares your toxic mindset and walk right out those double doors. It will save me a fortune on dinner service, and the air in this ballroom will instantly become much easier to breathe." Brenda flinched, stepping back as if I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, expecting him to intervene and play the peacemaker. But my husband simply stood at my side with his hands casually tucked into his pockets, wearing a look of absolute steel. I turned away from my speechless mother and calmly opened my custom-beaded clutch. I reached inside and bypassed the standard credit cards, pulling out a solid, heavy metal corporate black card. The matte black finish caught the light of the crystal chandeliers as I held it up. I turned my attention to the venue manager, who was still standing completely still, maintaining his rigid professional posture while holding the silver tray. I placed the heavy metal card directly onto the tray. The sound it made was a sharp, authoritative clink that seemed to echo over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "You are going to split this bill," I instructed the manager, my tone matching his absolute professionalism. "I am authorizing payment on this card strictly for my sweetheart table, the tables designated for my husband's family, and the tables seating my personal friends and colleagues. You will calculate the exact total for those seats and those seats alone. The VIP section and the tables reserved for the bride's extended family are completely off limits." The manager nodded sharply, retrieving a sleek digital tablet from his jacket pocket and immediately beginning to calculate the split. Brenda finally found her voice, staring at the black card on the tray with wide, unblinking eyes. Her voice was shrill and frantic. "What is that?" she demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the tray. "You do not have a corporate black card, Zuri. You do freelance public relations from your laptop in your living room. You do not make the kind of money that gets you an account like that. Jamal is the only one in this family with corporate accounts." I looked at my brother, who was now standing at the edge of the VIP lounge, his face pale and his fists clenched at his sides. He had heard the entire exchange and was slowly realizing the ground was falling out from beneath him. "I do not do freelance public relations," I said, projecting my voice so Jamal and his eavesdropping wife could hear every single word. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of a premier crisis management firm. I handle multi-million-dollar scandals for Fortune 500 executives and international politicians. I build safety nets for a living, Brenda. I investigate fraud, and I track missing assets for people who actually have wealth. Did you really think I was just sitting around typing a cute little blog while you two were bleeding my accounts dry?" Jamal took a step forward, his arrogant facade cracking rapidly. "Zuri, you need to calm down," he stammered, trying to use his deep, authoritative voice, but failing miserably. "We can talk about the family accounts on Monday. This is not the time or the place to discuss business." I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that made Chloe physically jump. "There is no business left to discuss, Jamal. I severed my ties to the family trust 3 days ago. The very minute I woke up from my final surgery and reviewed the bank alerts, I saw exactly what you and Brenda did. I saw the massive transfers you made while I was in the intensive care unit. I immediately called my attorneys and drained every single cent of my own contributions from that joint account. I legally dissolved my connection to the trust. That account you have been treating like a personal slush fund to buy Chloe's luxury cars and keep your failing logistics company afloat is completely empty." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She looked down at her empty glass of $500 champagne and then looked in sheer terror at the venue manager. The realization that she was sitting in a VIP section she could not afford was finally sinking into her dense brain. You cannot do that, Brenda shrieked, her hands flying to her head in a panic. That was family money. You have no right to cut us off without warning. Jamal has vendor payments due next week. We wrote checks against that account. You wrote bad checks against an account that no longer exists, I corrected her smoothly. You stole from a cancer patient. You stole from your own daughter while she was fighting for her life. And you were arrogant enough to assume I would just use whatever was left to fund this reception so you could show off to your friends. My money is protected now. You are entirely on your own. On. The venue manager cleared his throat, stepping forward with his digital tablet extended. He looked directly past me and focused his cold stare squarely on my mother and brother. I have separated the charges as requested, he announced, his voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. The bride has successfully authorized payment for her designated guests. I took one step closer to the floral arrangement separating my table from the dance floor. I looked dead at Brenda and Jamal, my expression devoid of any mercy or hesitation. You owe the venue $28,000 for your side of the guest list and the VIP bar tab you just ran up, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. Pay it now or security throws you out. Jamal's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. The illusion of his absolute control was fracturing right in front of his wealthy, snobbish friends, who were now awkwardly setting down their champagne glasses and avoiding eye contact. Chloe aggressively shoved her elbow into his side, hissing at him under her breath to just pay the man so they could stop looking like beggars. Desperate to maintain his fragile facade of the billionaire logistics tycoon, Jamal puffed out his chest and reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a sleek silver credit card and slapped it onto the manager's tray with unnecessary force. He arrogantly told the venue manager to run the card and leave them alone, assuming the problem was instantly solved. The manager did not blink, and he certainly did not apologize. He pulled a portable payment terminal from his dark jacket, inserted the silver card, and waited in absolute silence. A sharp negative beep pierced the tense quiet of the ballroom. Decline, the manager stated, his voice carrying easily across the VIP lounge. Jamal stammered loudly, snatching the card back and blaming a random bank fraud alert before slapping down a second card. Another sharp beep echoed through the room. Declined. Chloe's face drained of all color as a third and then a fourth card were met with the exact same humiliating sound. The friends she had spent the last hour bragging to were now physically backing away, grabbing their coats and distancing themselves from the absolute embarrassment unfolding at the table. Brenda grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She desperately whispered that I needed to stop this immediately and pay the bill before the entire family was permanently disgraced in front of Atlanta's high society. I calmly pried her fingers off my arm one by one and stepped back into Julian's protective hold. I reminded her loudly that family money was for the living, and since she had already declared my impending death to justify stealing my medical savings, she could figure out how to survive on her own. I nodded to the manager. He raised a single hand, and 4 massive security guards in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the ballroom immediately surrounding the VIP section. "Sir, you and your party need to vacate the premises immediately," the manager ordered, his voice echoing across the now completely silent dance floor. The security guards closed in, grabbing Jamal by his upper arms when he stubbornly attempted to plant his feet. Chloe let out a shrill, embarrassing shriek as another guard directed her toward the exit without letting her grab the remaining bottle of champagne. Brenda was furiously sputtering threats about disowning me, but she was moving toward the door regardless, utterly terrified of being physically dragged out in her silver silk gown. The humiliation was absolute. The golden boy and his entourage were being marched out of a luxury hotel like common criminals, while 300 guests watched in stunning silence. Just as they reached the grand double doors of the ballroom, Jamal ripped his arm out of the security guard's grasp and spun around to face me. His massive ego simply could not handle being dismantled in public. His face was twisted in a mixture of profound embarrassment and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you have won, Zuri?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. You think your little crisis management firm makes you untouchable. I am the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I have elite investors backing my every single move, men with real power, men who can crush your pathetic business with a single phone call. He was completely unhinged now, spit flying from his mouth as the security guards moved to restrain him once again. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian and then at me, declaring that he was going to ruin my professional reputation permanently. He swore he was going to call his board of directors, his private equity backers, and his elite network of venture capitalists the very moment he got to the parking lot. He promised to make sure every single corporate client in the state knew I was a manipulative, unstable liability who abused her own family. Chloe was nodding frantically along behind him, typing aggressively on her phone, pretending she was already drafting emails to their non-existent high society connections to ruin my life. I did not shrink back. I did not let Julian step in to shield me from his pathetic outburst. I walked slowly across the custom monogrammed dance floor, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood until I was standing just 10 feet away from my raging brother. I crossed my arms over my wedding dress and tilted my head, smiling the most genuine, relaxed smile I had worn all day. "Make the call, Jamal." I challenged my voice, echoing through the silent, breathless ballroom. "Call your elite investors right now. Call the men funding your logistics empire and tell them exactly what happened here today. I want you to put them on speakerphone so everyone can hear how powerful you are." Jamal froze. His hand hovered over his phone, his arrogant sneer faltering as he registered the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. He stared at me, his mind struggling to comprehend why I was practically begging him to execute his ultimate threat. I took one step closer, dropping my voice to a lethal calm register that carried perfectly through the tense room. "Go ahead and call the backers who just approved your Series B funding last week, Jamal. Call them because I know exactly who those anonymous investors are. And in about 10 seconds, you are going to find out too." The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the bridal suite at the St. Regis, casting a warm golden glow across the room. Julian was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, wearing a plush white robe and pouring coffee from the silver room service cart. The heavy weight of yesterday's chaos had completely vanished, replaced by the quiet, peaceful reality that we were finally married. I leaned back against the pillows, taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air. For the first time in 6 months, I was not thinking about hospital monitors or chemotherapy schedules or my family's relentless toxicity. That perfect tranquility lasted exactly 12 minutes. My phone, which I had left on the nightstand, began to vibrate. It was not a single notification. It was a continuous, relentless buzzing that rattled the glass top of the bedside table. I reached over and grabbed the device, expecting to see a flood of congratulatory messages and photos from the reception. Instead, my screen was overflowing with frantic text messages from my lead crisis management team and a dozen of my closest friends. They all essentially said the exact same thing: log on to TikTok right now. I sat up, the peaceful morning instantly evaporating. Julian noticed the shift in my posture and set his coffee cup down, his eyes narrowing with immediate concern. I tapped the screen and opened the app. I did not even have to search for it. The algorithm had already pushed it to the top of my feed because it was spreading like wildfire across local Atlanta networks. It was Chloe. She was sitting in the front seat of her luxury SUV, the very same vehicle she and Jamal had purchased using my stolen medical funds. She was completely makeup-free, wearing an oversized gray sweater, with her blonde hair pulled up into a messy, chaotic bun. She was staring directly into the camera, with red-rimmed eyes, perfectly executing the classic distressed influencer aesthetic. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she began, her voice trembling as she wiped a single highly calculated tear from her cheek. "But the public needs to know the truth about what happened yesterday. My husband Jamal and I are completely traumatized." The video abruptly cut to a grainy, heavily edited 3-second clip from inside the church sanctuary. It was shot from the perspective of one of their awful friends sitting in the VIP section. The footage did not show Jamal violently ripping my wig off. It did not show my mother screaming insults at me. It simply showed Jamal holding the wig, looking distressed while I stood on the altar glaring at him. It was a masterpiece of deceptive framing designed to completely strip away the context of their assault. The video cut back to Chloe, who was now openly sobbing into her hands. Her performance was nauseatingly practiced. She weaponized her white tears with expert precision, playing the fragile, innocent victim who had been terrorized by an angry, bitter sister-in-law. She looked into the lens and spun a vicious, sickening narrative that made my blood run absolutely cold. Zuri is a narcissistic scammer, Chloe cried, her voice hitching perfectly. She has been manipulating this entire family for months. She faked the severity of her cancer. She exaggerated her illness to make everyone feel sorry for her, so she could drain the family emergency accounts. My husband worked so hard to build his business, and Zuri forced him to hand over his savings out of guilt. She used that money to throw a lavish luxury wedding while leaving us with nothing. She even tried to have us arrested at the reception when Jamal confronted her about the missing funds. I watched the view count at the bottom of the screen tick upward in real time. It was already crossing 500,000 views. The comment section was an absolute bloodbath of strangers expressing their deepest sympathies for Chloe and demanding that I be exposed for faking a terminal illness. Local gossip blogs were downloading the clip and reposting it across every major platform. Chloe was leveraging her proximity to a wealthy Black family to garner sympathy, portraying herself and her husband as the innocent targets of a scam artist. She had taken the exact crime she and Jamal committed, stealing my chemotherapy funds, and completely flipped the script to accuse me of doing it to them. Julian moved to sit beside me on the bed, watching the screen over my shoulder. As he listened to Chloe's blatant lies, his body went entirely rigid. The soft, loving husband from 5 minutes ago vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless corporate attorney who destroyed lives in the courtroom. His breathing grew heavy, and his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding together. "Give me your phone," he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "I am calling my senior partners right now. We are drafting a cease and desist immediately. I am going to bury them in a defamation lawsuit so heavy they will not be able to afford the gas in that stolen car. They want to play games on the internet. I will freeze every single asset they possess before noon." He reached for his own phone, ready to unleash absolute legal hellfire. But I reached out and firmly placed my hand over his, stopping him from making the call. Julian looked at me, his eyes blazing with protective fury. "Zuri, she is publicly accusing you of faking cancer and committing financial fraud. This is textbook defamation. We have to shut it down." I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe's sobbing face, playing on a loop. I took a slow, deep breath, tapping into the cold, calculating mindset that made me the best crisis manager in the city. When I handled scandals for billionaires and politicians, the golden rule was always the same. When your enemy is digging a hole, you do not take away their shovel. You hand them a bigger one. "No," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Do not send the cease and desist. Do not call the lawyers yet." Julian stared at me in disbelief. "You want to just let her get away with this?" "I am not letting her get away with anything, Julian. I am giving her enough rope to hang herself permanently. If we shut her down today, we only get a retraction. I want them to go on podcasts. I want them to do follow-up videos. I want them to firmly attach their names, their faces, and Jamal's failing logistics business to this massive, verifiable lie. Every single view and every single share increases the financial damages they will owe me when I finally drop the hammer. Let the video go viral. Let them dig a much deeper grave. Because when I finally push them in, I want to make absolutely sure they can never climb out." Within 24 hours, the video was no longer just a local piece of social media gossip. It became a weapon, and my mother was the one happily pulling the trigger. Brenda did not simply ignore Chloe's fabricated narrative. She actively poured gasoline on it. Sitting in her immaculate suburban home, Brenda logged onto her Facebook account and shared the deceptively edited video directly to the private pages of her elite church congregations. She posted it to the Women of Faith and Excellence Board, the Regional Prayer Circle, and the Neighborhood Association group. Her caption was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She asked her community to pray for her deeply troubled daughter Zuri, who had seemingly lost her mind to greed and secular materialism. Brenda wrote long, passionate paragraphs about how she was mourning the loss of the loving daughter she once knew, claiming that my illness had completely altered my personality and turned me into a vindictive monster who was punishing her own brother for absolutely no reason. She painted herself as the heartbroken matriarch, desperately trying to hold her family together while I maliciously tore it apart. Seeing her mother-in-law's public endorsement emboldened Chloe. The validation from Brenda's church friends, who immediately flooded the comments with prayers and outrage, was the exact push Chloe needed to take her grift to the next level. Sympathy was a nice ego boost, but Chloe and Jamal needed hard cash. Their credit cards were maxed out. The hotel venue was undoubtedly threatening legal action for the unpaid $28,000 tab from the reception. Jamal's logistics company payroll was bouncing. They were drowning in debt, and they saw my face as their only life raft. By Tuesday morning, Julian and I were sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee and watching a brand new link circulate across every major platform. Chloe had officially launched a GoFundMe campaign. The title of the fundraiser was bold and completely shameless: Recovering from My Toxic Sister-in-Law's Financial Abuse. I clicked on the campaign link and read the description Chloe had carefully crafted. It was riddled with therapy buzzwords designed to maximize public outrage and open wallets. She used a photo of Jamal sitting on their living room sofa, holding his head in his hands, looking utterly defeated. She claimed that Jamal and I had shared a joint business account and that I had maliciously frozen his access on the day of my wedding, leaving his logistics company on the verge of bankruptcy. She painted Jamal as a hardworking, dedicated family man who had generously supported me through my cancer treatments, only to be financially ambushed when he was most vulnerable. She went as far as to claim she was considering pawning her own engagement ring just to keep their lights on. She asked for $50,000 to help save his business and cover the legal fees they supposedly needed to fight my narcissistic abuse. The sheer audacity of the campaign was breathtaking. They were not just trying to salvage their bruised egos anymore. They were actively monetizing my pain. They were using my cancer diagnosis, my wedding day, and the very theft they had committed against me as a lucrative fundraising strategy. It proved exactly what I had known for years. Brenda, Jamal, and Chloe did not view me as a human being. They viewed me as a resource. My existence, my illness, and my boundaries were only relevant to them if they could be converted into a direct deposit. They would stop at nothing to maintain their luxury lifestyle, even if it meant scamming sympathetic strangers on the internet. Julian set his coffee mug down on the granite counter with a sharp thud. His eyes were locked on the glowing screen of his laptop, watching the donation counter tick upward in real time. Strangers were leaving comments full of venom directed at me, accompanied by donations of $50, $100, and even $500. Brenda's church friends were organizing matching donation drives. People who had no idea they were funding a woman's luxury car payments and a man's failing vanity project were emptying their pockets out of misplaced pity. This escalates things from civil defamation to federal wire fraud. Julian set his voice tight with controlled anger. They are using an electronic platform to solicit funds based on deliberate, verifiable falsehoods. They are crossing state lines with every donation that comes in. I am calling the firm. We are documenting every single transaction, every IP address, and every single comment. I nodded, leaning back in my chair and taking a slow sip of my coffee. Keep logging it, I instructed him, my tone completely devoid of the panic Chloe and Jamal were desperately hoping to inflict. Capture everything. Let the balance keep climbing. Let them feel the rush of all that stolen money pouring into their pending account. I knew exactly what was happening in Jamal's house right now. He and Chloe were likely refreshing the page every 10 seconds, watching the numbers rise and celebrating their brilliant strategy. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had found a loophole to force the public to pay the massive bills they had racked up trying to ruin my wedding. They were riding the high of instant viral sympathy, completely blinded by their own extreme greed. They were so obsessed with the rising balance on their fraudulent campaign that they had completely forgotten a fundamental fact about my life. They forgot what I actually do for a living. I do not just manage public relations and draft press releases. I untangle massive financial webs. I track stolen corporate funds, expose fraudulent executives, and hand irrefutable evidence over to federal regulators. I investigate complex financial crimes every single day. And my arrogant, desperate brother had just publicly documented his own massive fraud scheme on a highly regulated platform. They were popping champagne over their rising balance, completely unaware that they had just handed a crisis management expert the exact digital trail I needed to destroy them permanently. I pushed my coffee mug aside and stood up from the kitchen island, leaving the glowing laptop screen behind. Julian watched me in silence as I walked down the hall and unlocked the door to my home office. This room was not a standard suburban study. It was a secure, climate-controlled command center equipped with 3 encrypted monitors, a dedicated private server, and a whiteboard wall that currently held the skeletal outline of my brother's financial ruin. I did not throw temper tantrums on the internet. I did not post tearful videos begging for public sympathy. I dismantled corrupt infrastructures for a living, and today my target just happened to share my last name. I booted up my primary terminal and immediately bypassed the standard user reporting features on Chloe's fraudulent fundraising page. When you are the chief executive officer of a premier crisis management firm, you do not wait in a digital customer service queue. You call the executives directly. I picked up my secure line and dialed the personal cell phone number of the Vice President of Trust and Safety for the crowdfunding platform. I had quietly handled a massive data breach scandal for his parent company 2 years ago, saving him his job and his stock options. He answered on the second ring. I kept my voice completely devoid of emotion as I laid out the situation. I informed him that an active campaign trending on his platform was currently soliciting funds across state lines based on verifiable medical and financial fraud. I did not ask him to look into it. I emailed him a heavily encrypted file containing my surgical records, my banking statements proving the timeline of the stolen emergency funds, and the exact routing numbers Jamal had attached to the campaign. I gave him a courteous but firm deadline. I told him he had exactly 4 hours to lock the account and freeze the incoming donations before I went to the federal authorities and named his platform as a willing accomplice to wire fraud. The executive practically tripped over his own words, assuring me it would be handled instantly. He knew my reputation. He knew I never made a threat I could not back up with devastating documentation. With the GoFundMe neutralized, my focus shifted to the larger target. Jamal had spent the last 3 years pretending to be a self-made logistics tycoon while secretly treating our family emergency trust like a personal piggy bank. Chloe's careless video had essentially handed me the missing pieces to his financial puzzle. I opened a secure forensic accounting software program and began tracing the exact path of the money they had stolen from me while I was fighting cancer. Jamal was sloppy. He was so arrogant and accustomed to Brenda covering his tracks that he had not even bothered to launder the stolen funds properly. He had transferred my chemotherapy savings directly into his failing company's payroll accounts to cover his massive negative balances. Then he had funneled the excess cash straight into his and Chloe's personal checking accounts to pay for her luxury SUV and their designer wardrobes. It was a textbook case of corporate commingling and tax evasion. He was claiming massive business losses on paper, while secretly injecting stolen family funds to finance a millionaire lifestyle. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a flawless, undeniable dossier. I cross-referenced his public corporate tax filings with the illicit transfers, highlighting every single discrepancy, every hidden asset, and every fraudulent deduction. I packaged the entire digital footprint into a single clean, highly incriminating file. I did not send it to a general tip line. I utilized a secure anonymous portal directly linked to a contact I frequently collaborated with at the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. My contacts specialized in high net worth tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. I flagged the file with priority markers indicating an ongoing flight risk, given Jamal's recent sudden influx of illicit crowdfunding cash. I pressed send and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the progress bar complete. Julian walked into the office carrying 2 fresh bottles of mineral water. He handed me one and looked at the 3 monitors displaying the frozen GoFundMe page, the sent IRS dossier, and the plummeting metrics on Chloe's social media accounts. The crowdfunding platform had not just paused the campaign, they had slapped a massive red banner across the top of the page, stating it was officially under investigation for fraudulent activity. The generous strangers who had been donating hundreds of dollars were now flooding Chloe's comment section, demanding their money back and tagging local news stations. "You work fast," Julian murmured, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face as he read the platform's public fraud notice. "They are going to absolutely panic when they realize they cannot withdraw a single cent of that money." I took a long drink of the cold water, keeping my eyes on the screens. "They are about to panic over something much bigger than a frozen internet campaign," I replied. I followed the money trail all the way down to the bottom. "Julian, Jamal and Chloe are not the only ones hiding massive financial crimes to fund this fake high society image." Before Julian could ask what I meant, my personal cell phone began to ring. The shrill, aggressive ringtone pierced the quiet hum of the servers in my office. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID flashed with Brenda's name. The great matriarch of the family who had proudly endorsed my public humiliation just 24 hours ago was calling me. I swiped the screen to answer and put the phone on speaker, setting it down on the polished mahogany desk. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Brenda's voice exploded through the speaker, a chaotic, hysterical screech that was completely stripped of her usual arrogant polish. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as she screamed into the receiver. "Zuri, you have to come to the house right now," Brenda shrieked, the sound of heavy boots and loud, authoritative voices echoing in the background of her call. "There are federal agents swarming the front lawn. They are tearing apart my home office. They have badges, Zuri. They are asking questions about a fraudulent second mortgage on the estate. You have to call your lawyers and make them stop. Tell them there has been a mistake. Tell them to leave my house." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, and stared at the blinking green light of the active call. I took a slow, calming breath, letting the sound of my mother's absolute terror wash over the quiet room. I smiled, listening to the satisfying sound of a toxic empire finally crashing to the ground. The drive to my mother's sprawling suburban estate took exactly 45 minutes. I spent the entire ride in absolute silence, watching the manicured lawns and gated driveways of Brenda's pristine neighborhood blur past the passenger window. Julian drove with one hand resting comfortably on my knee, his physical presence a steady anchor grounding me in reality. We did not need to discuss strategy. We both knew exactly what we were walking into. Brenda and Jamal had spent their entire lives operating under the assumption that rules simply did not apply to them. Today, they were learning the hard way that the federal government does not care about your social standing at the local country club or how well you project the illusion of success. Julian parked his car at the bottom of the long circular driveway, deliberately blocking the exit. The massive mahogany front door of the house was standing wide open, a jarring sight for a woman who usually kept her home locked up like a fortress to keep the neighbors from peering in. As I stepped over the threshold, the air inside felt heavy, thick with the distinct metallic scent of an overheated paper shredder. The pristine foyer that Brenda obsessively maintained was littered with discarded manila folders and stray receipts. The sound of frantic tearing paper and muffled shouting echoed from the formal living room down the hall. I walked slowly, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, absorbing every detail of their complete unraveling. When I reached the arched doorway of the living room, I stopped and simply watched. It was a scene of absolute pathetic chaos. Jamal was on his hands and knees, frantically shoving bank statements and unfiled tax returns into a black garbage bag. His designer dress shirt was unbuttoned, his tie thrown carelessly over a chair, and sweat beaded heavily on his forehead. Brenda was standing by the antique writing desk, feeding documents into a heavy-duty shredder as fast as the machine would take them. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess, her hands visibly trembling as she jammed thick stacks of paper into the smoking blades. But the most satisfying part of the spectacle was Chloe. She was pacing the length of the Persian rug, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. The fragile, tearful victim, who had successfully scammed half the internet just hours ago, was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had just realized the golden goose she married was actually a rotting albatross. "You told me the house was paid off!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she threw a crumpled bank statement directly at Jamal's head. "You told me the logistics company was clearing $2 million a year. This paper says your corporate accounts are overdrawn by $40,000. It says the Mercedes is 3 months behind on lease payments. You do not own anything, Jamal. It is all fake. You are leasing the cars, you are leasing the office space, and your mother took out a fraudulent second mortgage just to pay for our destination honeymoon." "Shut up, Chloe," Jamal barked, grabbing the paper and shoving it into the trash bag without looking at it. "You do not understand how corporate finance works. The IRS is just doing a random audit. It is a misunderstanding. I just need to move some cash around to show liquidity until my next big shipping contract clears." "Move! What cash?" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at him, her face red with absolute rage. "The cash you stole from your sister with cancer. The cash we just begged for on the internet. Do you understand that federal agents were just knocking on this door, asking questions about wire fraud? They are freezing the GoFundMe. They are freezing everything. I left a successful commercial real estate broker for you because you promised me generational wealth and a luxury lifestyle. You are a broke fraud who lives off his mother and steals from sick people." Brenda slammed her hand against the desk, stopping the shredder. "Do not speak to my son that way!" She snapped, her voice shrill and desperate. "We are a family of means. We are simply experiencing a temporary cash flow disruption due to Zuri's selfish behavior. If your sister-in-law had not been so vindictive about her wedding funds, none of this would be happening. We just need to get the paperwork organized before they come back with a federal warrant." I leaned against the doorframe, letting Brenda's delusion echo in the large room. She was still trying to blame me while actively destroying federal evidence. The sheer level of their narcissism was almost clinical. They had built an entire empire out of maxed-out credit cards, stolen medical funds, and fraudulent loans. Chloe had bought into the illusion, completely ignoring the obvious red flags, because Jamal bought her designer bags and promised her a life of leisure. Now the illusion was shattering into a million jagged pieces, and they were tearing each other apart, trying to escape the fallout. I cleared my throat. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. All three of them froze. Jamal dropped the garbage bag, spilling papers across the rug. Chloe spun around, her eyes wide with panic. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Julian stepped into the room behind me, his imposing frame filling the doorway, shutting down any possibility of them escaping this confrontation. "Zuri." Brenda breathed, her voice dropping into the high-pitched, fragile tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate me. "Thank God you are here. It is an absolute nightmare. There has been a terrible mistake with the taxes and the bank. The government is targeting us unfairly. You have to call those high-powered crisis people you work with. You have to fix this. Fix it right now. Tell them Jamal is a legitimate business owner." Jamal scrambled to his feet, wiping the sweat from his face, trying to pull together some semblance of his usual arrogance. "Yeah, Zuri. You caused this mess by locking the joint account and cutting off my operating capital. You need to call them off. Tell them the money you gave me was a business investment, not a medical fund. If you clear this up, I will take down the GoFundMe. We can issue a retraction and just call it even." He was trying to bargain with me. He was facing federal prison for wire fraud and tax evasion, and he honestly thought he could negotiate his way out of it by offering to delete a social media post. I did not yell, I did not scream, I did not demand apologies for the stolen money, the ruined wedding, or the viral defamation video. I simply walked across the Persian rug, my expression entirely blank and clinical. I stopped in front of the glass coffee table directly between Jamal and my mother. I lifted my arm and dropped a massive 3-inch thick stack of printed documents onto the glass. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room. It was not a random pile of papers. It was the exact duplicate of the dossier I had submitted to the IRS. It contained every forged signature, every hidden transfer, every fake tax return, and the complete digital footprint of their fraudulent fundraising campaign, highlighting the exact path of the money they had stolen from me. I looked at my mother and then at my brother, watching the last shreds of their arrogance drain away as they stared at the evidence of their own destruction. "I am not here to fix anything," I said, my voice ice cold. "I am here to show you exactly who pulled the trigger." The silence that followed was absolute. Jamal stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Chloe was the first to move. She lunged forward, her manicured hands trembling as she snatched the top file from the stack. It was the master ledger, the exact roadmap of their financial decay that I had meticulously compiled. I watched Chloe's eyes dart back and forth across the pages, scanning the highlighted columns of debt, the bounced payroll checks, and the empty corporate accounts. "You did this!" Jamal choked out, finally finding his voice. He took a step toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You tipped off the feds. You reported your own flesh and blood to the IRS. I reported a sophisticated tax evasion ring that was illegally soliciting funds across state lines." I corrected him, my tone perfectly even. "You reported yourself, Jamal, the moment you decided to beg for money on a public platform using verifiable lies. I just provided the regulatory agencies with the missing paperwork." I reached past him and pulled a very specific manila folder from the center of the stack. I opened it and laid the contents flat on the glass coffee table, right next to the shredded remains of whatever Brenda had been frantically trying to destroy. It was a copy of the official property deed to the family estate, alongside a recently approved loan contract from a private wealth bank. "Let us talk about the real reason the federal agents were knocking on your door this morning." "Brenda," I said, shifting my gaze to my mother, "let us talk about the $300,000 second mortgage you took out on this house." Chloe dropped the ledger she was holding. "A second mortgage," she repeated, her voice hollow. "Jamal, you told me this house was a family trust. You told me it was fully paid off and part of our inheritance." Jamal refused to look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, the veins in his neck bulging. Brenda stepped in front of him, shielding her precious son just as she always did. She raised her chin, attempting to summon the haughty, matriarchal authority that had ruled this family for decades. "It is a simple line of credit," Brenda said stiffly. "It is standard financial maneuvering to leverage equity for business expansion. It is perfectly legal, and it is absolutely none of your business, Zuri." "It became my business 6 months ago," I replied, tapping my index finger directly on the final page of the loan agreement. "Look at the signature line, Brenda. Look at the name listed as the primary guarantor." Chloe leaned over the table, her eyes widening as she read the printed text. "It is Zuri's name," Chloe whispered, stepping back as if the paper had burned her. "Zuri is the guarantor." I kept my eyes locked on my mother, forcing her to look at me. 6 months ago, I was in the oncology ward at Emory University Hospital. It was the second day of my 3rd round of aggressive chemotherapy. I was heavily medicated on a continuous morphine drip, drifting in and out of consciousness. I could barely lift my head off the pillow, let alone read a legal document. And that is exactly when you came to visit. You walked into my hospital room wearing your Sunday best, carrying a bouquet of cheap bodega flowers and a clipboard. You brought a man with you, a notary public named Arthur Vance, who just so happens to sit on the deacon board of your precious church. You stroked my hair and told me you needed my signature on some routine health insurance updates so the hospital would not interrupt my treatments. You held the pen in my shaking hand and guided it across the paper. I was fighting for my life. I trusted my mother to protect me. But you were not securing my health insurance. You were securing a $300,000 loan against the family estate. You used my flawless credit score, my decade of meticulous financial planning, and my unblemished financial history to bail out Jamal's sinking company because his credit was already completely destroyed. You committed federal mortgage fraud and identity theft while sitting beside your daughter's cancer bed. The room spun into a new dimension of chaos. Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She turned to Jamal, hitting him squarely in the chest with both hands. "You told me you secured a round of angel investing!" Chloe shrieked, her voice breaking into hysterical sobs. "You told me the business was booming. That is when you bought me the diamond upgrade. That is when we booked the trip to St. Bart's. You bought my diamonds with money your mother stole from your dying sister. You are sick. You are both absolutely sick." Jamal grabbed Chloe by the wrist, trying to hush her, trying to maintain control of a situation that had already completely evaporated. "Chloe, stop it," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed runway capital." The market shifted. "It is just a temporary setback." "There is no runway, Jamal," I stated, cutting through his pathetic excuses. "The bank froze the accounts yesterday when the IRS flagged the discrepancies in your tax returns. The logistics company is dead. The cars will be repossessed by Friday. And the GoFundMe money you were banking on is currently sitting in a federal holding account. You have absolutely nothing left." Chloe ripped her hands away from Jamal. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of the wealthy, successful husband was entirely gone, replaced by the reality of a weak, fraudulent parasite. She did not say another word to him. She simply turned around, grabbed her designer purse from the armchair, and walked out the front door. The sound of her car engine revving in the driveway signaled the definitive end of their marriage. Jamal stood in the center of the living room, staring at the open doorway. He looked utterly destroyed. He slowly turned his head to look at his mother, waiting for her to fix it, waiting for her to magically conjure a solution out of thin air, just like she had done his entire life. But Brenda could not fix this. The federal agents had the original notary logs. They had the hospital visitor records. They had the IP addresses from the wire transfers. The infrastructure of her deceit had been completely dismantled. I stood there waiting. Despite everything, despite the stolen money, the ruined wedding, the public defamation, and the staggering depth of her betrayal, a tiny microscopic part of my soul was waiting for her to break. I was waiting for the mother in her to finally surface. I was waiting for her to fall to her knees, to apologize, to cry, and beg for forgiveness for treating my life as completely expendable. Instead, Brenda carefully smoothed the front of her expensive silk blouse. She rolled her shoulders back and looked at me with eyes so devoid of maternal warmth they looked like black glass. She did not shed a single tear. She did not offer a single apology. "You were given 6 months to live, Zuri," she said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "The doctors told us your body was rejecting the chemotherapy. You were supposed to die. Your brother has a wife, a business, and an entire future ahead of him. I simply made a practical family decision. Why on earth would I let a perfect credit score go to waste when you were not going to be around to use it anyway?" The silence in the living room was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of my mother's sheer sociopathy. She looked at me without a single flinch or tremor of regret. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her chin held high, as if she had just explained a simple household budgeting decision rather than confessed to predatory federal fraud. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to spin. I looked at the shredded documents littering the Persian rug and then back to the woman who had given birth to me. The reality of what she had done crashed over me completely, severing the final frayed thread of my familial loyalty. "You were waiting for me to die," I stated, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the room. "Every time you sat by my hospital bed, every time you brought those cheap bodega flowers, you were not praying for my recovery. You were checking my pulse. You were waiting for the monitor to flatline so you could harvest my assets without consequence. You literally bet on my death to fund a fake millionaire lifestyle for your son." Brenda's composure finally cracked. The cold, calculated matriarch vanished, replaced by a furious, cornered animal. She took a step toward me, her face contorting with absolute rage. "Jamal is the man of this family!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. "He has a legacy to build. He is carrying the family name. You were practically on your deathbed. What did you need the credit for? You had no husband, no children, and no future. I took what was necessary to ensure your brother could survive in the business world. That is what families do, Zuri. They make sacrifices for the greater good." The sheer profound lack of empathy in her words pushed me past the point of no return. I felt a cold, clinical detachment wash over my entire body. I was no longer a daughter, standing in her childhood home mourning the loss of a mother. I was a crisis manager, standing in a crime scene assessing two highly liable targets. They had not just stolen my money. They had looked at my cancer diagnosis and seen a highly profitable business opportunity. "I did not make a sacrifice, Brenda," I replied, stepping forward and forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "You made a theft. You stole from a woman fighting a terminal illness, and you handed that stolen capital to a man who is too incompetent to build anything on his own." Julian moved to stand directly beside me, his presence a looming threat. His eyes were dark with a protective fury that I knew he was barely keeping in check. As a senior corporate attorney, Julian did not deal in emotions. He dealt in consequences. "The bank has already been notified of the forged notary stamp," Julian stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "My firm has submitted the sworn affidavits and the hospital security logs proving Zuri was incapacitated when that document was signed. The notary you used has already flipped to save his own license. He admitted you paid him $2,000 to falsify the state seals. You are looking at wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. You will not be building a legacy, Brenda. You will be liquidating this estate to pay federal fines before reporting to a minimum security facility." Brenda's face went completely ashen. She stumbled backward, bumping into the heavy mahogany writing desk. Her hands gripped the edges of the wood as she struggled to process the reality of federal prison. The impenetrable armor of her suburban church-going persona was completely shattered. Jamal, who had been standing silently near the fireplace watching his mother take the brunt of the legal assault, suddenly stepped forward. His face was flushed with embarrassment and bruised pride. He could not stand being exposed as a fraud in front of me, and he certainly could not stomach Julian, a highly successful black man, looking at him with such unfiltered pity and disgust. Jamal fiercely adjusted the cuffs of his designer shirt and puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his shattered masculinity. He kicked a pile of shredded paper out of his way and let out a loud, arrogant scoff. "You two think you have me cornered?" Jamal sneered, pointing a finger at Julian and then at me. "You think freezing a GoFundMe and crying to the IRS is going to destroy me? You do not know anything about corporate business, Zuri. You manage PR scandals for a living. I build logistics empires. I am a self-made CEO." I looked at him in total disbelief. His wife had just walked out on him. The federal government was auditing his fraudulent accounts, and his mother was facing prison for bailing him out. Yet his ego was so massive and so deeply ingrained that he was still attempting to play the role of the untouchable mogul. "I do not need your credit score," Jamal spat, his voice dripping with condescension. "That loan was just a temporary bridge. I have a massive deal closing by the end of the week. My private equity investors are flying in from Chicago tomorrow morning. They are injecting $5 million into my operations. They are going to bail me out of this minor tax misunderstanding completely. By Friday, I will write a check to pay off that stupid second mortgage, and I will buy and sell your little crisis management firm before lunch. You cannot touch me, Zuri. My investors will make sure of it." The absolute silence that followed Brenda's justification was heavier than concrete. Julian shifted his weight, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear the faint click of his teeth. He took a half step forward, a purely protective instinct triggered by the staggering cruelty of a mother casually discussing her daughter's anticipated death as a financial opportunity. I raised my left hand just an inch. Julian stopped, instantly respecting my silent command. This was my execution to carry out. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. For 34 years, I had exhausted myself trying to find a shred of genuine maternal warmth behind her polished country club exterior. I had analyzed every slight, Every backhanded compliment, every deliberate exclusion, hoping to find some miscommunication I could fix. But looking at her now, staring into her cold, unblinking eyes, I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of liberation. There was nothing to fix because there was nothing there. She was completely hollow. "I'm going to enjoy watching the federal prosecutors dismantle your life, Brenda," I said, my voice devoid of any anger or sorrow. "You will not survive a minimum security camp. You will break the moment they strip you of your designer clothes and force you to scrub a cafeteria floor. And I will not accept a single collect call from you when it happens." I turned my body, completely dismissing her existence, turning my full focus to the man still puffing out his chest by the fireplace. Jamal was clinging to his imaginary lifeline, desperate to prove he was the corporate titan he pretended to be on social media. $5 million, I repeated, letting the number hang in the stale air of the living room. From a private equity firm in Chicago. That is a massive capital injection for a logistics company currently under federal audit, Jamal. What was the name of this miraculous firm that decided to throw millions of dollars at an overdrawn CEO? Jamal smirked, his confidence returning in a rush. He adjusted his collar, looking at Julian with a challenging sneer. "Apex Horizon Partners," Jamal announced loudly. "They are a premier distressed asset fund. They looked at my operational infrastructure and recognized the long-term scalability. They flew out an associate last week to finalize the term sheets. They practically begged to buy up my outstanding debt and provide operational liquidity. That is how real business is done, Zuri. You leverage institutional capital." I did not laugh. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I woke the screen with a swipe and tapped the secure application that held my corporate portfolios. "When I was lying in that hospital bed, Jamal," I said, my tone conversational as I navigated through the encrypted files. "When I was hooked up to machines fighting the poison in my veins, I had a lot of time to think about legacy. I realized that if I actually died, my assets would default to my next of kin, meaning you and Brenda. I could not let that happen. So I restructured my entire financial portfolio from that hospital bed. I established a master holding company to manage my investments anonymously, shielding them from family interference. I tapped a file and turned the tablet around, holding the glowing screen up so Jamal could see the high-resolution corporate registry documents. The holding company is called Obsidian Financial," I explained, watching his eyes track the text on the screen. Obsidian Financial owns a diverse portfolio of subsidiaries across the country. We specialize in acquiring toxic debt from failing companies. We look for arrogant, desperate business owners who are so eager to maintain their fake lifestyles that they will sign absolutely any term sheet put in front of them without having a competent lawyer review the fine print. Jamal's smirk began to falter. The color slowly drained from his face as he read the name listed at the very top of the corporate hierarchy. "Apex Horizon Partners is a shell LLC," I stated, my voice dropping to a surgical precision. "It is a wholly owned subsidiary of Obsidian Financial. I am the sole proprietor, Jamal. There are no Chicago investors. There is no miracle bailout." He stepped back, bumping into the stone mantel of the fireplace. "No," he stammered, shaking his head. "No. I met with their associate. I signed the contracts. They wired the initial bridge loan yesterday to cover the lease payments on the warehouse." "Yes, they did," I confirmed, taking a step closer to him. "And in exchange for that $5 million capital injection, you signed over the controlling equity of your logistics firm. You were so desperate to keep Chloe from seeing your bounced checks that you handed over the keys to your entire kingdom for pennies on the dollar. I bought your secured debt, Jamal. I own 80% of your business. I own the warehouse lease. I own the trucks. I own the routing software." The room started to spin for him. I could see his chest heaving as the reality of the trap snapped shut around his ankles. He looked at Brenda, but she was still paralyzed by the desk, unable to comprehend anything beyond her own impending federal indictment. Jamal forced a harsh, strained laugh. He shook his head violently, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You cannot do that. That is illegal. That is a massive conflict of interest. It is entrapment. I will invalidate the term sheets. I will call my lawyers and have the entire agreement voided by tomorrow morning. I am the chief executive officer of that company, Zuri. I will just fire your firm and find new backers. You cannot touch me. I lowered the tablet and slowly pulled back the cuff of my blazer, exposing my watch. I looked at the sleek dial, noting the exact time before looking back up at my brother's desperate, sweating face. "You were the CEO," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Until the emergency board meeting that happened exactly 10 minutes ago. We took a shareholder vote. You have been officially terminated for gross financial misconduct." The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of Jamal's downtown logistics headquarters. He pushed through the revolving doors with the practiced stride of a man who believed the world owed him an apology. He had spent the entire night convincing himself that my display at the estate was nothing but a theatrical bluff. In Jamal's distorted reality, I was still just his quiet, sickly sister who could be intimidated into submission. He was the golden child, the untouchable heir apparent. He genuinely believed he could march into his office, charm his hand-picked executive board, and have them invalidate the acquisition based on some fabricated claim of corporate espionage. He bypassed the reception desk, completely ignoring the terrified look on the receptionist's face as he marched down the executive corridor. He adjusted his silk tie and shoved open the heavy oak doors to the main conference room, ready to launch into a charismatic speech about hostile takeovers and family loyalty. The words died in his throat the moment the doors hit the wall. I was sitting in his custom leather chair at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. Julian stood right beside me, his hands resting casually on a thick leather briefcase packed with stamped legal filings. The 6 members of Jamal's executive board men he had personally hired to stroke his ego were seated around the table in absolute suffocating silence. None of them looked at him. They were staring down at the thick manila folders placed in front of them, containing the undeniable proof of his embezzlement. "What is this?" Jamal demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to project a dominance he no longer possessed. "You all know who built this company. You know who signs your paychecks. I want her and her lawyer removed from this building immediately. Security should have never let them pass the lobby." Nobody moved. The chief financial officer, a man who had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to hide Jamal's chaotic spending, slowly closed his folder and looked away. "You do not sign the paychecks anymore, Jamal," I said, leaning back in the chair. "Obsidian Financial signs them. And as the majority shareholder, I have spent the last hour reviewing the catastrophic state of this company with your former board." They were highly motivated to cooperate once Julian explained the federal penalties for being complicit in corporate tax fraud. "They have unanimously ratified your termination. You are currently trespassing on private property." Jamal's face flushed a deep mottled red. He gripped the edge of the table, leaning forward like a cornered predator. "You cannot do this, Zuri. I will tie this up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will bleed your little holding company dry in legal fees. I am the face of this brand. You fire me and the entire operational structure collapses." Before he could finish his desperate threat, the heavy oak doors swung open again, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Chloe stormed into the boardroom, her face flushed with absolute outrage. She had clearly not spent the night packing her bags or reconsidering her life choices. She was wearing a brand new trench coat and clutching her phone like a weapon. The fragile betrayed wife routine from the previous night had been entirely replaced by raw materialistic panic. "Jamal, you need to fix this right now," Chloe shrieked, completely ignoring the room full of silent executives. She marched straight toward him, waving a sleek metal credit card in his face. "I am at the boutique picking up my reserved bags and my black card was declined. The manager told me the account was frozen. They cut my card in half right in front of the other clients. You told me the personal accounts were separate from the business audit. You promised me my allowance would not be touched." Jamal grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the table, his eyes darting frantically toward his former executives. "Chloe, shut up," he hissed through clenched teeth. "We are in the middle of a board meeting. You cannot be here right now." "I am not going anywhere until my cards are turned back on," Chloe yelled, yanking her arm out of his grip. "I am not living like some peasant because you cannot manage your accounting department. I have a lifestyle to maintain. I need the 50,000 transferred to my personal checking by noon, or I am calling my divorce lawyer and taking half of everything. I rested my elbows on the table and let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the perfect, beautiful climax to their collective delusion. Chloe's blatant, unapologetic misuse of company funds for personal luxury items was the exact missing piece I needed to completely destroy any lingering sympathy the board might have had for Jamal. She had just walked into a room full of federal witnesses and demanded her stolen corporate allowance. Julian reached over and pressed a button on the conference table console. The lights in the room automatically dimmed, and a large projector screen lowered silently behind me. "There is no $50,000 to transfer, Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the dark room. "And there is certainly no half of everything for you to take. You cannot divide assets that belong to the federal government." The projector clicked on, illuminating the room with a massive high-definition spreadsheet. It was a complete forensic audit of the corporate credit card Chloe was currently holding. I clicked a small remote in my hand, highlighting specific rows of data for the entire executive board to see. "Let us review the lifestyle you have been maintaining on the company dime," I said, keeping my tone completely clinical. "Last month you charged $40,000 at a private jeweler in Paris and coded it as a corporate client gifting expense. 2 weeks ago, you spent $15,000 on a chartered flight to Miami and filed it under logistics surveying. You have been bleeding this company's operational budget dry to buy shoes, vacations, and spa treatments, while the employees sitting at this very table were told there were no funds for annual bonuses." Chloe stared at the massive screen, her mouth hanging open as every single fraudulent purchase she had made over the last 2 years was laid bare in front of a dozen silent men. The exact dates, the vendor names, the staggering dollar amounts. It was a digital monument to her absolute greed. Jamal stumbled backward, his hands running frantically over his face. He knew it was over. He could not charm his way out of a projected forensic audit, and he could not bully me into hiding it. The illusion was dead, the money was gone, and the federal consequences were waiting right outside the glass doors. The morning sun glared off the tinted windows of Jamal's leased Porsche Macan as he tore into the reserved executive parking space of his logistics headquarters. He threw the vehicle into park and sat in the quiet cabin, gripping the leather steering wheel with white knuckles. He had spent the entire sleepless night building an impenetrable fortress of denial. Zuri was lying. She had to be lying. A woman recovering from a terminal illness did not orchestrate a multi-million-dollar hostile corporate takeover from a chemotherapy recliner. He convinced himself that the supposed emergency board meeting she claimed took place the night before was nothing but a pathetic scare tactic. She was merely trying to intimidate him into surrendering his leverage. In Jamal's distorted reality, Obsidian Financial was just a meaningless shell game, a desperate bluff designed to humiliate him in front of their mother. As for Brenda facing imminent federal prison time, Jamal rationalized that she had simply been sloppy. He was not sloppy. He was the golden child. He was the self-made, untouchable chief executive officer. He genuinely believed he could march into his office, charm his hand-picked executive board, and have them invalidate any hostile action based on some fabricated claim of corporate espionage. He pushed through the revolving glass doors of the lobby with the practiced, arrogant stride of a man who believed the world owed him a profound apology. He bypassed the reception desk, completely ignoring the pale, terrified look on his receptionist's face as he marched toward the private executive elevators. He could hear the distant, rhythmic rumbling of the warehouse floor where hundreds of employees were currently moving freight, keeping his empire alive. They were doing the actual heavy lifting while he prepared to ascend to his pristine, glass-walled sanctuary to reassert his dominance. The elevator doors chimed open on the top floor. Jamal adjusted his bespoke Italian silk tie and smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket. He strode down the wide corridor, mentally rehearsing his speech. He would walk into the boardroom, exude absolute confidence, and order his executives to officially ban Zuri's crisis management firm from the premises. He would reassure them that the massive capital injection from Chicago was still arriving by noon. His blind arrogance was an iron shield preventing him from seeing the absolute doom waiting for him at the end of the hall. He still viewed his sister as the weak, compliant sibling who could be bullied into submission. He reached the heavy, double mahogany doors of the main conference room. He did not knock. He placed both hands flat against the polished wood and shoved them open with aggressive force, ready to command the room. The words died in his throat the absolute second the doors hit the wall. The temperature in the expansive room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. I was already sitting at the absolute head of the long glass conference table. I was occupying his custom imported leather chair. My posture was perfectly rigid, my hands steepled on the reflective surface of the table. Julian stood directly to my right, acting as my legal vanguard. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and his hands rested casually on a thick leather briefcase packed with stamped certified legal filings. The 6 members of Jamal's executive boardmen he had personally hired and overpaid to stroke his massive ego were seated around the perimeter of the table. The room was suffocatingly silent. Not a single man looked up when Jamal barged in. They were entirely focused on the thick manila folders placed squarely in front of them, containing the undeniable itemized proof of his staggering embezzlement. "What is this?" Jamal demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to project a dominance he absolutely no longer possessed. He stepped into the room, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You all know who built this company. You know who signs your paychecks. I want her and her lawyer removed from this building immediately. Security should have never let them pass the lobby." Nobody moved. Richard, the chief financial officer, a man who had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to hide Jamal's chaotic spending, slowly closed his folder and stared at the floor. Marcus, the vice president of operations, rubbed his temples and refused to make eye contact. "You do not sign the paychecks anymore, Jamal," I said, leaning back in his custom chair, letting the leather creak in the quiet room. "Obsidian Financial signs them. And as the majority shareholder, I have spent the last 2 hours reviewing the catastrophic state of this company with your former executive board." Jamal's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He gripped the back of an empty chair, leaning forward like a cornered animal. "You cannot do this, Zuri. I will tie this up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will bleed your little holding company dry in legal fees. I am the face of this brand. You fire me, and the entire operational structure collapses. My Chicago investors will bury you." Julian let out a short clinical breath of amusement. He unlatched his briefcase, the metallic clicks echoing loudly. "Your Chicago investors do not exist," Jamal Julian stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Obsidian Financial holds the debt. You signed away controlling equity yesterday afternoon. The board members sitting at this table were highly motivated to cooperate once I explained the federal penalties for being complicit in corporate tax fraud. They have unanimously ratified your termination. You are currently trespassing on private property." Before Jamal could formulate a response, before he could launch into another desperate threat about lawsuits and brand identity, the heavy mahogany doors behind him burst open a second time. Chloe stormed into the boardroom, her face flushed with absolute unfiltered outrage. She had clearly not spent the previous night packing her bags or reconsidering her life choices. She was wearing a brand new designer trench coat, her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. The fragile betrayed wife routine from the previous night had been entirely replaced by raw materialistic panic. She was clutching her phone like a weapon, completely oblivious to the tense corporate standoff she had just interrupted. "Jamal, you need to fix this right now!" Chloe shrieked, completely ignoring the room full of silent, horrified executives. She marched straight toward him, waving a sleek metal corporate credit card in his face. "I was just at the boutique picking up my reserved bags, and my black card was declined. The manager told me the account was frozen. They cut my card in half right in front of the other clients. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Jamal grabbed her arm, his eyes darting frantically toward his former executives. He tried to pull her away from the table, his voice dropping to a desperate hiss. "Chloe, shut up. We are in the middle of an emergency board meeting. You cannot be here right now. Go wait in my office." I am not going anywhere until my cards are turned back on, Chloe yelled, yanking her arm violently out of his grip. I am not living like some peasant because you cannot manage your accounting department. I have a lifestyle to maintain. You promised me the personal accounts were separate from the business audit. You promised my allowance would not be touched. I need the $50,000 transferred to my personal checking by noon, or I am calling my divorce lawyer and taking half of everything. I rested my elbows on the glass table and let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the perfect, beautiful climax to their collective delusion. Chloe's blatant, unapologetic admission of misusing company funds for personal luxury items was the exact missing piece I needed. She had just marched into a room full of highly cooperative witnesses and demanded her stolen corporate allowance. She had completely destroyed any lingering sympathy the executive board might have harbored for Jamal. Julian reached over and pressed a button on the master conference console. The heavy motorized blackout blinds instantly slid shut, blocking out the morning sun. A large, high-definition projector screen descended silently from the ceiling directly behind me. There is no $50,000 to transfer, Chloe, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the darkened room. And there is certainly no half of everything for you to take. You cannot divide stolen corporate assets. The projector clicked on, illuminating the room with a massive, meticulously color-coded spreadsheet. It was a complete forensic audit of the corporate credit card Chloe was currently clutching in her hand. I picked up a small remote, pointing it at the screen to highlight specific rows of highly incriminating data. Let us review the lifestyle you have been maintaining on the company dime, I said, keeping my tone completely clinical as the board members turned their attention to the screen. Last month, you charged $40,000 at a private jeweler in Paris and coded it as a corporate client gifting expense. 2 weeks ago, you spent $15,000 on a chartered flight to Miami and filed it under logistics surveying. You have charged spa, treatments, designer shoes, and country club membership fees to the operational budget. You have been bleeding this company dry, while the employees sitting at this very table were explicitly told there were no funds available for their annual bonuses. Chloe stared at the massive screen, her mouth hanging open in horror as every single fraudulent purchase she had made over the last 2 years was laid bare in front of a dozen silent men. The exact dates, the vendor names, the staggering dollar amounts. It was a digital monument to her absolute, unbridled greed. The executive board members glared at Jamal, their expressions shifting from passive submission to absolute disgust. They had sacrificed their own compensation while his wife treated the company ledger like an endless personal trust fund. Jamal stumbled backward, his hands running frantically over his face. He knew it was entirely over. He could not charm his way out of a projected forensic audit, and he could not bully me into hiding it. The illusion was dead. The stolen money was gone. And the federal consequences were finally coming due. 7 days had passed since the reality of federal prison and total financial ruin had crashed down upon my family in that boardroom. I sat at a corner table in the private dining room of Laura, the most exclusive French restaurant in the city. The ambient lighting caught the gleam of crystal wine glasses and heavy silver cutlery. I had specifically chosen this restaurant because it was where Brenda always forced us to celebrate Jamal's fabricated milestones. Tonight, I was using it to conclude business. I checked my watch. They were exactly 20 minutes late, a classic Brenda power play designed to make me anxious. I was not anxious. I was simply waiting for the final act to begin. The heavy mahogany doors to the private room swung open. Brenda marched in first, flanked by Jamal and Chloe. Despite being functionally bankrupt and facing federal indictments, they walked with an astonishing level of unearned arrogance. Brenda was wearing a vintage Chanel suit she had likely pulled from the back of her closet, trying desperately to project the image of an untouchable matriarch. Jamal looked slightly haggard, his eyes carrying the dark circles of a man who had not slept, but his chin was still tilted upward in a defiant sneer. Chloe trailed behind, clutching a mid-tier designer bag, looking around the room as if sizing up who she could still impress. They had completely convinced themselves that this dinner invitation meant I had finally caved to the suffocating pressure of familial duty. They truly believed that my week of silence was just me throwing a temper tantrum before inevitably opening my checkbook to clean up their disastrous messes. Brenda did not even greet me. She slid into the plush booth opposite my chair, snapping her fingers at the waiter who had quietly followed them in. "We will take the Chateau Margaux," she commanded, her tone dripping with entitlement. "The vintage reserve. Bring 2 bottles, and put it on my daughter's tab. She is paying tonight." The waiter glanced at me for confirmation. I gave a single slow nod. I wanted them to have exactly what they asked for. Brenda settled back into her chair, smoothing her napkin over her lap, and let out a long dramatic sigh. "I knew you would come to your senses, Zuri," she began, her voice adopting that familiar condescending lilt. "I told Jamal just yesterday that you were simply having an emotional reaction. You have been through a lot with your illness, so we are choosing to be graceful about that little stunt you pulled at the office last week. But frankly, allowing the bank to formally foreclose on the family home was just a step too far. It was incredibly tacky." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the crisp white tablecloth. I did not interrupt her. I wanted to hear every single delusional word they had rehearsed. Jamal leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He tried to lock eyes with me, attempting to summon his old intimidating aura. "Look, Zuri, you proved your point. You made your money in the shadows and you bought up my debt. Congratulations. But that confession document you forced me to sign was completely invalid. I signed it under extreme duress. My new lawyer assured me a judge will throw it out before it even reaches a courtroom. So we are going to tear that paper up tonight. You are going to restructure the debt you hold on my company, and I will generously allow you a minority seat on the board. That is a more than fair settlement." Chloe slammed her manicured hand flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "And my accounts need to be unfrozen by tomorrow morning," she demanded, her face turning a blotchy red. My Pilates instructor actually had the nerve to ask me why my card was declined yesterday. Do you have any idea how deeply humiliating that is for me? You cannot just cut off our livelihood because you are holding a grudge about a loan. You have more money than you know what to do with. You owe us the lifestyle we built." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their demands hung in the air, filling the room with a toxic cocktail of narcissism and entitlement. They had forged my signature while I was hooked to chemotherapy machines. They had stolen millions of dollars. They had gambled away their home and their businesses. Yet here they were, sitting in a private dining room, ordering $1,000 wine on my tab and demanding that I apologize for holding them accountable. They had learned absolutely nothing. In their minds, I would always be the subordinate, the scapegoat, whose only purpose was to finance their grand illusions. "Family always forgives family," Brenda stated, reaching for her water glass with a practiced, elegant sweep of her wrist. "When you were sick, we did what we had to do to survive the emotional toll. We made financial decisions to protect the legacy of this family. You should be thanking us for keeping everything afloat. Now, I have already spoken to the bank manager. If you wire the outstanding mortgage balance plus the penalty fees by 8 tomorrow morning, they will halt the auction process and reinstate the deed in my name. We can put all this ugliness behind us." The waiter arrived, carrying the 2 bottles of extremely expensive wine, pouring generous glasses for Brenda, Jamal, and Chloe. They picked up their glasses immediately, ready to toast to their perceived victory. I looked at the 3 of them, observing the smug, satisfied smiles creeping onto their faces. They really thought they had won. I reached down beside my chair and picked up my heavy leather designer tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment, the metallic sound cutting sharply through the quiet room. I did not say a word about family loyalty. I did not argue about the validity of Jamal's confession. I did not respond to Chloe's pathetic complaints about her Pilates instructor. I pulled out a heavy brass keyring holding 3 shiny new keys. I placed it gently on the center of the table. Next, I pulled out a thick legal document bound in a blue protective cover featuring the official gold seal of the county clerk's office. I placed my hand flat against the heavy parchment and slowly slid it across the smooth surface of the table until it rested directly in front of Brenda's wineglass. Brenda's eyes locked onto the gold seal like a starving predator. A sickeningly triumphant smile stretched across her face. She reached out her manicured fingers, grazing the heavy parchment, ready to snatch back the symbol of her suburban royalty. I clamped my hand flat over the blue cover and smoothly dragged it back across the table, stopping just inches from my own plate. Brenda's smile vanished instantly. Her hand hovered in the empty space above the tablecloth. "What are you doing, Zuri?" She snapped, her tone sharp and impatient. "Give me the deed. The bank needs my signature to finalize the reinstatement." I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I did wire the money to the bank this morning," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I paid the entire outstanding mortgage balance, the accumulated late fees, and the federal penalties you triggered." The foreclosure auction was canceled. Jamal let out a loud, arrogant breath, leaning back and crossing his arms. "See, I told you, Chloe. I told you she was just throwing a tantrum to prove a point. She paid the house off. Now hand over the paperwork, Zuri, so we can enjoy this ridiculously expensive wine and pretend last week never happened." "You misunderstand the transaction, Jamal," I replied, setting my glass down. "I did not reinstate Brenda's mortgage. I bought the property outright from the bank as a distressed corporate asset. The deed is fully executed and registered. It is entirely in my name." The heavy crystal wine glass slipped from Brenda's hand. It tipped over, spilling dark red vintage Chateau Margaux across the pristine white tablecloth like a spreading bloodstain. She did not even attempt to grab a napkin. She stared at me, her carefully constructed mask of superiority shattering into 1,000 pieces of pure panic. "You cannot do that!" Brenda gasped, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "That is my home. That is the family estate. You cannot just steal it out from under me." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and locked eyes with her. "You stole it from yourself, Brenda. You forfeited that house the absolute second you used it as collateral to secure a fraudulent bridge loan for Jamal's failing company. You were so blinded by greed that you did not even read the fine print of the bank's penalty clauses. When the federal auditors flagged Jamal's accounts last week, they automatically triggered an emergency lien on the property. The bank was legally obligated to seize the asset to cover the projected federal fines. They did not just foreclose on you. They actively accelerated the auction process because you used a forged notary stamp to tie my supposed life insurance payout to your mortgage terms. Jamal slammed both of his hands onto the table, rattling the silverware. "You set us up," he shouted, his face twisting with rage. "You manipulated the holding company to buy the debt just so you could steal our house. I will sue you. I will drag you into civil court and expose this entire operation." "You have absolutely zero legal claim, Jamal." I fired back, my voice cutting through his volume with icy precision. "You do not own a single brick of that property." Obsidian Financial purchased a foreclosed asset directly from a federally insured bank in a completely transparent cash transaction. You committed federal fraud. I engaged in standard real estate acquisition. There is no judge in this country who will entertain a lawsuit from a disgraced executive currently under investigation for embezzlement. Chloe's head whipped back and forth between Jamal and me, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "Wait," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Wait, Jamal, what does she mean? If the bank seized the house and she bought it from the bank, then who owns the house? Where are we supposed to live? Jamal, you promised me the house was protected." Jamal turned on her, his face contorted with stress. "Shut up, Chloe. Just shut up for 1 minute and let me think." "Do not tell me to shut up!" Chloe screamed, standing up so fast her chair crashed to the floor behind her. "You told me we were rich. You told me your sister was going to bail us out. Now my credit cards are cut in half, and you are telling me we are completely homeless. I am not living in a shelter, Jamal. I am calling my divorce lawyer right now." Chloe spun around and marched toward the heavy mahogany doors, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. Jamal scrambled out of the booth and chased after her, leaving Brenda sitting frozen across from me, staring at the dark wine soaking into the tablecloth. Brenda slowly raised her head. The arrogant matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified woman, realizing the absolute finality of her ruin. "Zuri," she whimpered, her voice shaking. "Zuri, please. I am your mother. You cannot do this to me. You cannot throw me out on the street. I have nowhere to go. I have established residency. You cannot legally lock me out of my own home without due process." I reached into my designer bag one final time. I pulled out a single stark sheet of white paper. I placed it gently on the table, sliding it over the spreading wine stain until it rested directly in front of her trembling hands. "Family always forgives family, Brenda," I said, echoing her own toxic words back to her. "But landlords do not forgive squatters. You are not a resident. You are a former owner illegally occupying a foreclosed property owned by Obsidian Financial. As the sole legal owner of the estate, I am serving you with a formal 30-day eviction notice. You have exactly 1 month to pack whatever designer clothes you can carry before my private security firm physically changes the locks." Brenda stared at the 30-day eviction notice as if the stark black ink was physically burning her eyes. The majestic facade she had violently maintained for 3 decades completely dissolved, leaving nothing but a terrified, hollow woman clutching a stained linen napkin. I did not stay to watch her cry or beg. I stood up, signaled to Julian, and walked out of the private dining room, leaving Brenda alone with the spilled vintage wine and a bill she could absolutely no longer afford. That night marked the definitive end of the family dynasty. The fallout was swift and utterly merciless. Chloe, desperate to maintain her illusion of extreme wealth and terrified of the impending federal indictments, made one final catastrophic miscalculation. She launched a highly publicized fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. She painted herself as the tragic victim of a vicious corporate conspiracy, begging her thousands of social media followers for donations to cover her fabricated legal defense and basic living expenses. She raised nearly $80,000 in 3 days by manipulating the sympathy of strangers. It took the federal authorities exactly 4 days to freeze the account. They cross-referenced her IP address and financial routing numbers, adding wire fraud and cyber deception to her rapidly growing list of federal charges. She was publicly arrested at an exclusive luxury spa while trying to use the stolen donation money to pay for a thermal mud wrap. The viral video of her being escorted out in handcuffs, her face bare and panicked, effectively ended any chance she had of securing a favorable divorce settlement. She traded her designer wardrobe for a federal holding cell. Jamal suffered the hardest and most humiliating fall. Stripped of his chief executive officer title, his corporate backing, and his mother's endless financial safety net, he was forced to face the real world with absolutely zero survival skills. The leasing company repossessed his Porsche Macan right out of the hotel parking lot where he was temporarily staying. His hand-picked executive board testified against him in exchange for strict federal immunity, detailing every single unauthorized transfer and offshore account to the authorities. With his personal assets frozen pending the massive embezzlement trial, Jamal was evicted from his luxury suite. The golden child, the untouchable heir apparent, was now living in a cheap roadside motel off the interstate. He spent his days dodging calls from aggressive creditors, and his nights staring at the water-stained ceiling, realizing that his entire identity had been built on stolen money and my silent submission. He had nothing left to leverage, and nobody left to charm. Brenda experienced a different kind of imprisonment. Her entire life revolved around her immaculate reputation within our affluent church community. She was the head of the charity committee, the ultimate paragon of maternal virtue. That illusion was entirely incinerated the moment the public records of her foreclosure and my property acquisition were published in the local Financial Gazette. The details of the forged notary stamp and her attempt to leverage my life insurance policy while I was actively fighting stage 4 cancer spread through the congregation like wildfire. The same women who used to hang on her every word suddenly crossed the street to avoid her. She was quietly asked to step down from all church committees and social boards. Stripped of the sprawling family estate, she was forced to downsize into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. There were no more garden parties, no more catered luncheons, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. Her unbridled greed had isolated her, completely trapping her in a prison of her own making. 3 months later, the autumn air carried a crisp, refreshing chill. I stood on the sprawling stone balcony of my newly acquired estate, overlooking the vast manicured grounds that now legally and exclusively belonged to me. The massive oak doors, the grand sweeping staircase, the towering windows, every single inch of it was a testament to my survival. Julian stepped out onto the balcony holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He handed me one and stood beside me, leaning comfortably against the stone balustrade. "The transition of the logistics company is fully complete," he said, his tone carrying a rare note of genuine satisfaction. "The new executive board has stabilized the profit margins, and the federal prosecutors have officially set Jamal's trial date for next month. He is facing up to 15 years. I took a slow sip of the dark coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I did not feel pity. I did not feel guilt. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I reached up and ran my free hand over my head. My hair was finally starting to grow back. The harsh, slick baldness of chemotherapy was gone, replaced by a thick, tight layer of natural dark curls. It felt like a crown, a real earned crown that nobody could ever forge, steal, or demand I hand over to make them feel superior. My body was healing, my mind was sharp, and my future was entirely my own. For my entire life, I had been the sickly shadow, the quiet scapegoat expected to bleed out silently so my mother and brother could shine. They had looked at my cancer diagnosis as a convenient financial exit strategy. They had tried to bury me beneath their staggering debts and their blinding narcissism, assuming I would just quietly fade away and leave them the spoils. But they forgot that seeds grow in the dark. The pressure they applied did not crush me, it only forged me into something infinitely harder. My resilience had elevated me to heights they could not even comprehend. I took a deep breath, filling my healthy lungs with the crisp morning air. I was entirely independent. I was financially untouchable. The family that had tried to destroy me was currently suffocating in the ruins of their own unbridled greed. I had survived the cancer, and I had survived them. Now I reign. True strength isn't about seeking vengeance. It's about reclaiming your worth after being undervalued by those who should have protected you. When toxic family members try to bury you to elevate themselves, your greatest revenge is simply surviving, thriving, and building a fiercely independent life. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can control your boundaries. Letting go of the desperate need for their conditional approval is the ultimate key to your freedom. Sometimes the family you are born into isn't your true home, and walking away is the bravest, most necessary step toward finding your own peace. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys.